Hello everyone, I am the Scary Midnight Dreams and I am here to help you to sleep today. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also comment where are you from and what time is in your country right now. The Wailing Tree. In the center of the village of Black Hollow stood an ancient oak, its gnarled branches clawing at the sky like the twisted fingers of a crone. The villagers called it the Wailing Tree. For each night, as darkness fell, it emitted an eerie, bone-chilling scream that echoed through the valley. No one dared to approach the tree after sunset, for its roots were said to cradle the remains of a vengeful witch, Agnes Thorne, who had been burned at the stake centuries ago. Legend had it that her dying curse had bound her spirit to the tree, her agony forever etched into its twisted bark. For years, the villagers lived in uneasy coexistence with the Wailing Tree. They avoided it, warned their children to steer clear, and offered small tokens, coins, bread, and flowers at its base in a futile attempt to appease the spirit within. But the screams persisted, growing louder with each passing year, as if the witch's torment deepened with time. One stormy night, a young blacksmith named Elias, driven by a mixture of curiosity and defiance, decided to confront the tree. He had grown tired of the villagers' superstitions and believed the screams were nothing more than the wind howling through the hollow trunk. Armed with an axe and a lantern, he ventured into the village square as the first wails began to pierce the night. The closer he approached, the colder the air grew, and the screams seemed to take on a human quality. Pleading, accusing, and filled with unrelenting pain. Elias hesitated, but pressed on, determined to prove there was no curse. As he raised his axe to strike the tree, the lantern flickered and went out, plunging him into darkness. The screams ceased abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence that made his ears ring. Then a voice, low and venomous, whispered from the shadows. "You dare disturb my rest?" Elias spun around, but no one was there. The ground beneath his feet trembled, and the roots of the tree began to writhe like serpents. One root coiled around his ankle, pulling him to the ground. "You are all the same," the voice hissed. "You burn, you destroy, and you forget. But I will make you remember." The bark of the tree split open, revealing a hollow filled with bones, human bones, blackened and cracked. A spectral figure emerged, her form wreathed in flames that did not burn but radiated an unbearable heat. It was Agnes Thorne, her face a mask of fury and anguish. Elias tried to free himself, but the roots held him fast. The witch extended a hand, her fingers curling like talons. "Feel my pain," she said, her voice rising to a shriek. The villagers, roused by the unearthly noise, gathered at the edge of the square. They watched in horror as the Wailing Tree glowed with an otherworldly light, its branches thrashing as if in agony. When the light faded, Elias was gone, and the tree stood silent once more. From that night on, the Wailing Tree no longer screamed, but its bark bore a new feature. The face of a man, frozen in a silent cry of terror. The villagers, now more fearful than ever, avoided the square entirely, letting the tree stand as a grim reminder of the price of defying the curse. The Wailing Tree became a legend, a tale whispered to children to keep them from wandering too far at night. But those who dared to approach it swore they could still feel a presence, hear a faint whisper, and see the face in the bark shift ever so slightly, as if trying to scream once more. The Silver Mirror's Curse. It was a cold, fog-laden evening when Lady Eleanor Ravenscroft first laid eyes upon the mirror. An antique of singular beauty, its frame wrought from the finest silver, polished to a gleam that seemed to catch the very essence of the moonlight. The mirror, she was told, had been passed down through generations of noble families, each one guarding it as a sacred heirloom. Its origins were shrouded in mystery, its past drenched in whispers of ancient curses, and dark prophecies. But to Lady Eleanor, it was but an exquisite ornament, one that would grace the walls of her estate and reflect the grandeur of her name. She had acquired it at great expense, having been informed that no other mirror could match its beauty or craftsmanship. The moment it was delivered to Ravenscroft Manor, she ordered it placed in her private chamber, where it would stand as the centerpiece of her most cherished possessions. It was, she believed, a symbol of her status, her elegance, and her future, a future that was surely destined for greatness. But from the very first moment she gazed into its depths, Eleanor felt a strange unease, an unsettling chill that crept down her spine. At first, she dismissed it as nothing more than the effect of the damp evening air. Yet, as the days passed, she found herself drawn to the mirror, its silver surface gleaming with an unnatural light. Each time she looked into it, she saw something new, something disturbing. At first it was subtle, a flicker of shadow in the corner of the reflection, an image of herself that seemed to move with a slight delay. But soon the reflections grew more vivid, more detailed. She saw herself, standing in the mirror, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with terror. She saw her hands, once delicate and graceful, now stained with blood, her fingers twisted in a grotesque manner, as if they had a will of their own. The visions grew more frequent, and with them, a growing sense of dread. She saw herself in the mirror, surrounded by the corpses of those she had once loved, her servants, her family, her friends, all lying in pools of blood, their faces contorted in expressions of horror. She saw herself standing over them, her lips curled in a cruel smile, her eyes gleaming with madness. It was not just a vision, she realized. The mirror was showing her future, a future in which she descended into madness, consumed by an insatiable thirst for blood. The reflection, once a thing of beauty, had become a harbinger of doom, a window into the darkest recesses of her soul. Lady Eleanor's nights were now plagued by nightmares, each one more horrific than the last. She would wake in a cold sweat, her heart pounding in her chest, only to find herself staring at the mirror, its silver surface gleaming with the promise of what was to come. She began to lose track of time, her mind unraveling as the visions grew more vivid, more real. She could no longer tell where the reflection ended and her own reality began. One fateful night, in the grip of a fevered delirium, Lady Eleanor stood before the mirror, her eyes wild with terror. She reached out a trembling hand, as if to touch the reflection, to grasp the future that awaited her. And as her fingers brushed the cold surface, the vision changed. The mirror no longer showed her face, but the face of another, a dark, twisted figure with eyes that burned like coals, a grin that stretched impossibly wide. The figure reached out to her, its hands as cold as death, and she felt herself drawn into the mirror, pulled into its depths. The next morning, the servants found her in the chamber, lying in a pool of blood. Her once beautiful face was contorted in an expression of horror, her eyes wide open, staring at the silver mirror that hung above her. The mirror was empty, its surface smooth and featureless, as if it had never reflected anything at all. And so, the legend of the silver mirror's curse was born. Some say that Lady Eleanor's soul was trapped within the mirror, doomed to live out her twisted future for all eternity. Others claim that the mirror still hangs in Ravenscroft Manor, waiting for its next victim, waiting for the next noble soul to gaze into its depths and see the madness that awaits them. But one thing is certain: the silver mirror is no mere ornament. It is a portal to a future drenched in blood and madness, a future that no one should ever wish to see. The Crypt Keeper's Promise. It was a night heavy with fog. the kind that clung to the earth like a mourner's shroud. The Grayson family gathered in the drawing room of their ancestral home, a sprawling estate whose grandeur had long since given way to decay. The air inside was thick with unease, a reflection of the storm brewing beyond the cracked windows. They had come together not for celebration, but for mourning. The patriarch, Harold Grayson, had passed just days before, his sudden death leaving behind a void that no wealth or legacy could fill. It was during the reading of his will that the crypt was first mentioned, a family mausoleum, hidden deep within the woods at the edge of the estate. The mention of the crypt sent a chill through the room, though none could say why. Harold had been a man of secrets, and his will was no exception. Among the usual bequests and formalities, it contained a single ominous instruction. The crypt must not be disturbed. To do so is to break the pact. What pact? Asked Eleanor, Harold's eldest daughter, her voice trembling. The executor of the will, a somber man named Mr. Farnsworth, hesitated before answering. It is not my place to say, Miss Grayson, but your father was most explicit. The crypt is to remain untouched. This, of course, only fueled the family's curiosity. Later that night, as the storm raged on, Eleanor and her younger brother Edward decided to investigate. Armed with lanterns and a key found among their father's belongings, they ventured into the woods. The trees loomed overhead like silent sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky. At last, they reached the crypt. It was a grotesque structure, its stone facade weathered and cracked, adorned with carvings of anguished faces and twisted vines. The air around it was colder than the night itself, and the siblings hesitated before inserting the key into the heavy iron door. As the lock clicked open, a low moan seemed to emanate from the crypt, though neither could say whether it was the wind or something far more sinister. Inside, the air was stifling, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. Their lanterns cast flickering shadows on the walls, which were lined with niches holding ancient, crumbling coffins. At the center of the crypt stood a stone altar, and upon it lay a parchment, its edges brittle with age. Eleanor picked it up, her hands trembling. The writing was in an archaic script, but the words were clear enough. To seal the pact, the bloodline must guard the crypt. To break it is to awaken the keeper and the horrors he binds. What does it mean? Edward whispered, his voice barely audible. Before Eleanor could answer, the ground beneath them began to tremble. A deep, guttural growl echoed through the crypt, and the shadows seemed to come alive, writhing and twisting like living things. "Run!" Eleanor screamed, grabbing Edward's arm. They fled the crypt, slamming the door behind them. But the growling did not stop. It grew louder, accompanied by the sound of shattering stone and the shriek of something ancient and hungry. Back at the estate, the rest of the family was waiting, their faces pale with fear. "What have you done?" their mother, Margaret, demanded. Before they could answer, the ground outside began to quake. The fog thickened, and a figure emerged from the woods. It was tall and gaunt, its face obscured by a hood. In its skeletal hands, it carried a staff carved with grotesque symbols. "The Keeper," Margaret whispered, her voice filled with dread. The figure raised its staff, and a voice like the grinding of tombstones filled the air. "The pact is broken. The bloodline must pay." The family's screams echoed into the night as the horrors of the crypt spilled forth, twisted, nightmarish creatures that clawed their way into the world. Eleanor and Edward fought to save their family, but the Keeper's wrath was unrelenting. It was only when Eleanor, in a moment of desperation, offered her own life in exchange for the others, that the onslaught ceased. The Keeper turned to her, its hollow eyes glowing with an eerie light. "The pact must be renewed," it said. With trembling hands, Eleanor took the parchment from the crypt and signed her name beneath her ancestors. The keeper nodded, and the creatures retreated, their forms dissolving into the fog. As the first light of dawn broke through the storm clouds, Eleanor stood alone before the crypt, her family safe, but forever changed. She knew she would spend the rest of her days guarding the crypt, bound by the same promise that had ensnared her ancestor. The keeper vanished into the shadows, leaving behind only the faint echo of its chilling laughter. The Whispering Coffin. The night was still, the air thick with the damp chill of early spring. Nathaniel Crane, the town's solitary gravedigger, worked under the pale glow of a waning moon. The cemetery stretched out before him like a sea of shadows, its crooked tombstones standing as silent witnesses to his lonely labor. Nathaniel was no stranger to the peculiarities of the dead. Over the years, he had grown accustomed to the strange creaks and groans that echoed through the graveyard at night, the occasional gust of wind that seemed to carry whispers from nowhere. But this night was different. He was filling in the last grave of the evening, a fresh burial for a woman named Eliza Winthrop, when he heard it, a faint, muffled voice. He froze, his shovel poised mid-air, straining to listen. "Help me!" The words were barely audible, but they were unmistakable. Nathaniel's heart raced as he glanced around the empty graveyard, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. But there was no one. The voice came again, clearer this time, and it was coming from beneath the freshly turned earth. "Please, let me out." Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat. He had heard tales of people being buried alive, of coffins scratched from the inside, but he had never imagined he would encounter such a horror himself. His first instinct was to run, but the desperation in the voice held him in place. He dropped his shovel and began to dig with his hands, clawing at the soil until his fingers bled. The voice grew louder, more frantic, urging him on. Finally, he reached the wooden lid of the coffin. With trembling hands, he pried it open. Inside lay Eliza Winthrop, her face pale and serene in the moonlight. Her eyes snapped open, locking onto Nathaniel's with a piercing intensity. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice a chilling blend of gratitude and malice. Before Nathaniel could react, she sat up, her movements unnaturally fluid. Her gaze bore into him, and he felt an icy grip around his heart. "You shouldn't have disturbed me," she said, her voice now layered with an otherworldly echo. Nathaniel stumbled back, his mind reeling. This was no ordinary woman, no victim of a tragic mistake. There was something ancient and malevolent in her eyes, something that did not belong to the world of the living. Eliza stepped out of the coffin, her bare feet sinking into the loose earth. The air around her seemed to grow colder, and the whispers began again, this time coming from all around him. Nathaniel turned to see figures emerging from the shadows, ghostly forms with hollow eyes and skeletal hands. "Why have you disturbed our rest?" one of them hissed. Nathaniel could barely speak, his terror rendering him mute. He turned back to Eliza, who now stood over him, her once beautiful face twisted into a mask of fury. "You've uncovered what was meant to stay buried," she said. "The sins of the Winthrop family run deep, and now their curse is yours to bear." Nathaniel tried to flee, but the spectral figures closed in, their hands cold as death as they dragged him toward the open grave. He screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the night. The next morning, the townsfolk found the graveyard eerily quiet. Nathaniel was nowhere to be found, but Eliza Winthrop's grave stood open, her coffin empty. The whispers began anew that evening, drifting through the cemetery like a mournful wind. Those who dared to visit the graveyard claimed they could hear Nathaniel's voice among them, pleading for release. And so the legend of the Whispering Coffin was born, a tale of betrayal, curses, and the price of disturbing the secrets of the dead. The graveyard became a place of dread, where no one lingered after sunset, and the name Nathaniel Crane became a warning to all who dared to dig too deep. The train that never stops? It was a night like any other when Jonathan Halloway, a weary traveler, found himself at the station. The clock had struck midnight, and the streets were empty, save for the occasional flicker of gas lamps casting long shadows upon the cobblestone. The station itself was quiet, its stone walls worn and weathered by years of neglect, the air thick with a damp chill that seemed to seep into the very marrow of his bones. He had been traveling for days, his journey stretching far longer than he had anticipated, and his eyes were heavy with fatigue. He longed only for rest, and when he saw the train waiting at the platform, its engine exhaling a soft plume of steam into the night air, he felt a strange relief. It was a carriage of old design, its iron frame blackened by time, its windows dimly lit with a soft golden glow that beckoned him forward. The station master, an old man with a thin white beard, gave him a nod as he approached. There was something odd about the man's gaze, something hollow in his eyes, but Jonathan thought little of it. After all, he was tired and eager to board. "Late night, sir," the station master remarked, his voice rasping as if he had not spoken in years. Jonathan nodded, offering a weary smile. "Indeed, I'm just looking for a place to rest." The station master's lips twitched into a thin smile. "This train will take you to your destination. It never stops, you see." Jonathan didn't fully understand the man's words, but he was too tired to inquire further. With a grunt, he boarded the train, finding an empty seat in one of the dimly lit compartments. The door slid shut with a soft hiss, and the train began to move, slowly at first, then gathering speed as it rumbled through the night. The carriage was oddly silent, save for the occasional creak of the old wood beneath him. The passengers, though numerous, sat in perfect stillness, their faces obscured by the shadows. Jonathan glanced around, but none of them seemed to acknowledge his presence. There was something unsettling about the stillness that hung in the air, as if the very train itself were a tomb, carrying the souls of the forgotten. As the train sped through the night, Jonathan began to notice peculiar details. The landscape outside the window seemed to stretch on endlessly, the same dark trees and empty fields passing by in an endless loop. The moon, full and cold, hung in the sky, casting a pale light over the scene. But no matter how long he looked, the scenery never changed. It was as if they were traveling through a void, a place untouched by time or the world beyond. And then he saw it. In the reflection of the window, a figure appeared. A man, his face gaunt and pale, his eyes hollow pits of darkness. The figure was staring directly at Jonathan, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. Jonathan's heart skipped a beat, and he turned quickly, but the figure was gone. His breath came in shallow gasps, and he felt a cold sweat prickling at the back of his neck. He tried to shake off the unease, but it only grew stronger as the minutes passed. The air in the carriage grew colder, and the shadows seemed to deepen, swallowing the light from the lanterns. Jonathan's gaze darted from one passenger to another, but none of them moved, their faces locked in expressions of despair, as if they were trapped in some eternal nightmare. He leaned forward, his voice trembling. "Where are we going?" But no one answered. A low, mournful whistle echoed through the train, sending a shiver down Jonathan's spine. The sound seemed to come from all directions, reverberating through the very walls of the carriage. It was a sound of death, a sound that carried with it the weight of centuries. Suddenly, the train lurched, and Jonathan was thrown from his seat. He gripped the armrest, his heart pounding in his chest, as the train plunged into a deep, unnatural darkness. The light from the lanterns flickered and died, leaving them in pitch blackness. The only sound was the rhythmic clatter of the train's wheels against the tracks. And then he heard it. A voice, soft and distant, but unmistakable. "Welcome aboard, Jonathan Halloway." His blood ran cold. The voice was familiar, yet he could not place it. It was as though it had come from the very depths of his own soul, a whisper that only he could hear. The words seemed to hang in the air, thick with malice. "Who are you?" Jonathan demanded, his voice cracking with fear. The voice answered, its tone low and mocking. "We are the ones who never leave, the ones who are bound to this train, forever trapped in its eternal journey. And you, Jonathan, have joined us." A cold hand clamped down on his shoulder, and he spun around, his eyes wide with terror. But there was no one there, only the darkness, pressing in on him from all sides. The train began to slow, its wheels screeching against the tracks as it came to a halt. The house without shadows. The storm rolled in with an unnatural ferocity, driving icy rain and howling winds through the desolate countryside. Jonathan Harrow, a weary traveler, clutched his cloak tightly around him as he stumbled along the muddy road. His lantern flickered weakly, its feeble light barely piercing the darkness. Just as he began to despair, the silhouette of a grand mansion emerged from the gloom, its towering spires cutting into the night sky. A faint golden glow emanated from its windows, promising warmth and refuge. Jonathan hurried toward it, his boots squelching in the sodden earth. The door opened before he could knock, revealing a butler whose pale face and solemn demeanor matched the house's eerie aura. "You seek shelter from the storm," the butler said, in a voice devoid of inflection. It was not a question, but a statement. Jonathan nodded, too cold and exhausted to question the strange man's tone. He stepped inside, grateful for the warmth that enveloped him. The interior of the mansion was opulent, yet oddly unsettling. Rich tapestries adorned the walls, and chandeliers cast a steady golden light. But as Jonathan removed his cloak, he noticed something peculiar. There were no shadows. The flames in the hearth burned brightly, the chandeliers glimmered, yet not a single object cast even the faintest outline on the polished floors or ornate walls. Jonathan's own figure stood stark and alone, as if the light passed through him without resistance. "Strange place you have here," he remarked, attempting to mask his unease. The butler inclined his head slightly. "Dinner will be served shortly. You are welcome to join the other guests in the dining hall." Jonathan followed the butler down a long corridor, his footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The other guests were already seated at a grand table laden with sumptuous dishes. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow, yet they greeted him with polite smiles. "Welcome," said a woman in a crimson gown, her voice lilting but distant. "It is rare to have new company." Jonathan took a seat, hunger overcoming his apprehension. The food was exquisite, each bite a burst of flavor that seemed to invigorate him. Yet, as the meal progressed, he noticed the other guests barely touched their plates. They sat still, their movements slow and deliberate, as if bound by some unseen force. "How long have you all been here?" Jonathan asked, attempting to make conversation. The woman in the crimson gown exchanged a glance with the man beside her, whose gaunt features seemed almost skeletal in the flickering light. "Time is difficult to measure here," she said finally. Jonathan's unease deepened. He excused himself after the meal and wandered the halls, hoping to find some explanation for the mansion's unsettling atmosphere. The absence of shadows followed him everywhere, a constant reminder that this place defied natural law. In one room, he found a mirror. As he approached, His reflection seemed to shimmer and distort. For a moment, he thought he saw other faces, dozens of them, their expressions twisted in agony. He stumbled back, his heart pounding. "You should not linger here," a voice whispered behind him. Jonathan turned to see the butler, his face as unreadable as ever. "What is this place?" Jonathan demanded. "The house without shadows," the butler replied. "It offers refuge, but at a cost." "What cost?" The butler hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "The house hungers. It feeds on the souls of those who dwell within. The longer you stay, the more it takes." Jonathan felt a cold dread settle over him. He had to leave. He hurried to the front door, but no matter how many halls he traversed or staircases he descended, he could not find the way out. The mansion seemed to shift around him, its corridors stretching endlessly. The other guests appeared as he wandered, their faces now gaunt and ghostly, their eyes pleading. "You cannot escape," the woman in the crimson gown whispered. "We are all part of the house now." Desperate, Jonathan returned to the dining hall, where the butler stood waiting. "There must be a way out," Jonathan pleaded. The butler's expression remained unchanged. "There is one way," he said, holding out a small, ornate dagger. "The house will release you if you offer it another soul in your place." Jonathan recoiled. "I can't do that." "Then you will remain," the butler said simply. Jonathan's resolve wavered as the oppressive atmosphere of the house closed in around him. The faces in the mirror, the hollow eyes of the other guests. They were all warnings of what he would become. But could he condemn another to save himself? The storm outside raged on, but Jonathan knew the true